Hello everyone, welcome to Going Back number 14, which is a follow-up to my hostile takeover video, which was all about the Purge and what year that took place in. This video will be addressing some of the feedback I got in response to that video. So if you have not already seen that one, or if you would like to refresh your memory, I highly recommend watching that first before continuing on with this one. And you can do that by clicking the link right up here. As always, I want to apologize for what I'm sure will be many mispronunciations of the usernames. But with that out of the way, let's dive in. For more than a decade, Lost fans have disputed what year the event known as the Purge actually took place in. This debate exists for good reason, as there is actually quite a bit of evidence to suggest two different years. Those being 1987 and 1992. So the first comment I wanted to address comes from user Showcosts, who says, "Love the subject, but you're missing out on two key pieces of evidence that were released after the series finale. One of the biggest being the script for The Man Behind the Curtain that confirms The Purge as 1992. That would settle it, wouldn't it? But we have another piece of evidence, albeit a very blurry one, in the lost slapdowns inside the writer's room, where we briefly see the timeline above the whiteboard that have the events of the Purge, Danielle arriving on the island, Alex being born, the Nigerian plane crashing, Flight 815 crashing, all in that order. And it shows December 19th, 1987. And then he links images from the lost slapdown. I will provide those same links in the description to this video, as well as a link to the slapdown in question that shows this. Did they retcon it? I think so. He then goes on to detail a conversation at the 2008 Comic-Con. I think the best way to see it is that the show retconned the Purge date between seasons 4 and 5. While planning season 5 and having the characters time traveling and flashbacking to events before and after the Purge, they were now setting it in 1987. It was 1992 in season 3, based on Mikhail's comment, the Man Behind the Curtain script, and what Horace says in the dream. But while writing the season 5 events with Ben and Ethan in the woods kidnapping Alex, the timeline in the writer's room had been rearranged with the 1987 date in mind. So at the time that this video came out, a little over a year ago, I really hadn't done a good job clarifying what exactly I was aiming to do with this series of videos, and what I was less interested in doing. And in the context of this video, I really should have clarified that the mystery I was trying to solve, or the question I was trying to answer, was purely in-universe. What I mean by that is going off of only what exists within the show, as well as additional story materials such as the epilogue, the Mysteries of the Universe segment, things which I personally regard as canon. I was wanting to establish which year makes the most sense in the context of the story. Because yes, ultimately I do agree with Showcosts that there are many things outside of the show that suggest behind the scenes the writers originally intended for it to be 1992, but then later on, when writing the later seasons of the show, they instead had the 1987 date in mind. Now I do want to note that the lost slapdown, where we see the timeline inside the writer's room, it does feel worth mentioning that a lot of what we see in the writer's room in that segment, in which they're taking Kermit the Frog through the writer's room, much of that is a joke and has been put on display specifically for that bit. But even so, I would agree that it's unlikely that they would have written a fake date for the Purge as part of this joke. There really wouldn't be any reason to do that. So I do still agree that that likely was there prior to the planning of this so-called slapdown. Anyways, the point is, yes, I agree, the writers seem to have changed the date in their minds as they were writing the show. And that is a major reason that there is evidence for the 1992 date, which mostly comes from the first half of the series, and then evidence for the 1987 date, which mostly comes from the second half. But what I'm interested in doing in these videos is making sense of things purely from a story perspective. So while I feel it is accurate to say there was a retcon, I am looking for a way to reconcile the conflicting evidence that exists within the story being told. Because while the writers may have intended 1987 to be the date as of the end of the series, that simple real world fact does not change the facts inside the series, inside the story, such as Kelvin's timeline, Dharma's apparent loss of access to the island after the Purge, and what Dream Horace says about being dead for 12 years. Since this video came out, and since Showcas provided this comment, I have gone on record a couple of times and specified that I'm never trying to say this is definitely what the writers intended, or this is definitely true because they said it was true at some point. During the many years they were making the show, and in the many years since they finished making it, they have made quite a few contradictory statements. I imagine when telling a story over many years, a story which is constantly being influenced by things outside of their control, their creative intent was always mutable. And therefore, they might have said something in an interview or in a podcast around seasons 2 or 3, which they later contradicted in seasons 5 and 6. This doesn't mean that they were lying before, or that they were making it up as they went along. It just means their vision shifted somewhat. The example I've used before is that if somebody were to ask me why Echo died, the real world answer is because the actor wanted to be killed off because he didn't like living in Hawaii and he wanted to move back to England. That is a well-known fact, and it is the correct answer to why Echo was killed. But generally speaking, when somebody is asking that question, that is not the answer they're looking for. And it is not one that they find satisfying. And I agree. Which is why those really aren't the answers I'm interested in. I think we can find and interpret very satisfying answers to questions like, why did the monster kill Echo? Or what year did the Purge take place in? And that's what I'm trying to do with this series and with this video specifically. I'm looking for sensible, evidence-based explanations that do not contradict what is definitively canon. And as I hopefully do a good job of illustrating in this video, I feel it is much more difficult to reasonably dismiss the evidence in favor of the 1992 date versus the 1987 date. The second big issue people point to in regards to the idea of Rousseau being present on the island during the Purge is the question of how she would have survived the toxic gas used to wipe out the initiative.
They're headed to the Tempest. And if they figure out how to deploy that gas, then everyone on this island is going to die.
Juliet, look me in the eye and tell me you are certain that Benjamin Linus wouldn't use this gas to kill everyone on this island. We know he's used it before.
Now, a little less than a kilometer from here, he has me working with chemicals. I could kill every man, woman, and child on this island if I flip the wrong switch.
So in a continuation of the conversation Showcas and I were having from that last comment, he also asked, what do you make of the other woman when Goodwin, Harper, and Charlotte say that the gas can kill everyone on the island? I do think the gas is probably capable of doing exactly that. But in either case, I don't really think that the gas was used to its full potential. I think it was only released in certain sectors of the island, and perhaps only the barracks specifically. As I state later on in this video, releasing the gas island-wide would likely have wiped out all of the animal life, which we know did not happen. I did mention this in response to Showcas, and he responded again. I agree the others wouldn't do that. I am not a biologist, but couldn't it be a gas that Dharma developed that didn't affect animals? We do hear various birds chirping during the Purge when Ben is at the barracks. So yeah, it is my understanding, based on the observations of other people that have contributed to the Lostpedia article on the Tempest, that the gases contained at the Tempest were nerve agents, and indeed the way in which the Dharma members seem to have died appears consistent with my understanding of how nerve agents work. Indeed, it has been pointed out that the chemicals listed on the Tempest computer screen add up to the nerve agent VX. Which would absolutely kill animals just as much as it would humans. As for the birds that can be heard chirping when Ben returns to the barracks after the Purge, in this same scene, Richard takes off his gas mask, and then so does everybody else, and they're obviously fine. I think it's safe to assume that they wouldn't have done this until they were absolutely certain that the gas had dissipated, which means at this point it would be perfectly plausible for birds to be in the vicinity without dying. For one, there is quite a bit of evidence suggesting that the others carried out the Purge off-island as well as on, and then absorbed the initiative's resources.
We have a report on the church originally investigated in this program. This past Christmas, several staff members have mysteriously disappeared. They were reported missing but never found. Public records show that the newly appointed general manager of the church is named Eloise Hawking. However, she has refused several requests for an interview. Destroyed records, missing persons, questionable documents, missing information. Has another organization secretly taken over the Dharma initiative?
This next comment comes from Snorri Jonsson. One minor note, your source for the information that the others purged Dharma off-island as well as on-island is the Mysteries of the Universe extra featurette. You mentioned the fact that in that program, the narrator mentions staff members of the church having mysteriously gone missing that past Christmas, which nicely matches the December 19th date of the Purge. But everything in this extra should be taken with a grain of salt, and probably considered non-canon, since this fake television program is supposed to have aired in 1982, nowhere near the year of the Purge. The only way this could be considered canon is if the others purged Dharma off-island 5 or 10 years before purging them on-island, which honestly wouldn't make any sense. So yes, the way that that segment is presented, it does make it very confusing when it is supposed to have aired. Snorri mentions 1982 as the year that it aired, and I agree there are actually a lot of clues that this is the year that it aired. The ABC logo that's used at the beginning, and the brief snippet of a promo for an upcoming new series
Monday here on ABC.
seems to place this airing, which has been taped, in late September 1982, or at least the bulk of it. Near the end of this featurette, a prompt comes on screen that tells us there have been some updates since the original airing of this episode.
Update. Since the original air date of this production, Mysteries of the Universe has uncovered startling new information about the secret organization, the Dharma Initiative.
And it is within that portion that it is mentioned that some of the employees from the church have gone missing. It is my belief that we are meant to infer that this update portion of what we're watching was added much later and obviously after the Purge has occurred, which in my view of things means it would have been added in 1993. Now there are some other things throughout this video that kind of muddle when exactly this was made. Somewhat early on, they mention that a college student wore a Dharma jumpsuit to a Halloween party in October of 1978.
Outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, 1978. A University of Las Vegas college student purchases a jumpsuit for a costume party at a local thrift store.
which would seem to indicate that at the absolute earliest, the original airing of this episode would have been 1979. And yet, when they interview a man that says his neighbor Phil went missing after interviewing for a security job, he estimates that Phil has been missing for about a year.
In the following interview, we speak with someone who claims that his neighbor vanished after completing a job interview with a mysterious group that was looking to fill an open position.
My neighbor Phil was looking for a job. He said he was on round 5 of an interview for this group out in Michigan. 5 interviews is a lot of interviews, especially for a security guard position.
So tell me, when was the last time you saw Phil?
Last time I saw Phil. He said something about going back for the last interview, and then I never saw the guy again. Someone came, sold his house, took his car, even took his dog. His girlfriend didn't even know. I called the police. They said they would investigate. It was a year ago. The guy's gone.
It seems heavily implied that the person he's referring to is the Phil that we see in season 5 of Lost. And we know he was on the island by 1974 at the latest, which would mean the interview with the neighbor would have to be taking place somewhere around 1975, 1976 at the latest. Granted, he doesn't seem at all sure about his estimate of how long it's been, but I do think it would be kind of ridiculous to assume that he has misgauged several years as 1 year. Another example of what kind of throws the timeline of this episode into question is what they say about Olivia going missing. In the earlier segment, they say that her apartment was subleased for 3 years, without stating what happened after those 3 years were up.
A grade school teacher named Olivia. Her family and friends said she applied for a teaching position, interviewed heavily for the job, and then left without a trace. Her apartment was subleased for 3 years, with no explanation of her absence.
And then in the later update segment, they say they have recently discovered that she had reappeared, but they don't indicate when exactly she returned or if they even know that.
We had told you the story of a school teacher from Portland, Oregon named Olivia who had taken a job offer and had mysteriously disappeared for 3 years. Since our broadcast, our investigative team has discovered that she has reappeared.
Personally, I think these seeming inconsistencies can be explained away by faulty research and follow-up. And the interview with Phil's neighbor may have taken place years before they actually made this episode. Indeed, it could have been one of the earliest reportings they had regarding this secret organization, and one of the initial interviews which eventually led them into this investigation. So all of that's to say, I don't personally find there to be any outright contradictions that can't somewhat easily be explained away. And the background information that's provided within it seems very much intentional to me on the part of the writers. And for that reason, I definitely prefer to regard it as canon. But as I've also said before, I don't fault anyone who would prefer to only regard the 121 episodes of the actual series as canon. And so with anyone that doesn't regard the Mysteries of the Universe episode as canon, and therefore wouldn't accept it as evidence that the Purge did occur off-island as well, that does kind of reopen the issue of whether or not Dharma would have been capable of sending Kelvin to the island after the Purge. And so in response to that, I would again point to things that we do know for sure from the show specifically, such as the fact that the others did commandeer the submarine, and that Dharma apparently never made an effort to return or reclaim the island, not to mention their complete lack of presence at the lamppost station, and that it is instead occupied by Eloise Hawking, who was never a part of Dharma, and was in fact a former leader of the hostiles. All of this show-established evidence suggests to me that the Dharma Initiative was also purged off-island. and therefore would not have been able to send Kelvin there all on his own. Which again, even if they had somehow still been around, that in and of itself would have seemed odd to me, that they only sent one person with no plan of replacing him or Rudzinski. Again, in my opinion, the only reasonable way to explain Kelvin's presence on the island after the Purge is that he was recruited before it happened. And since he was in Iraq in 1991, this would mean the Purge occurred in 1992. But what about intentionally lying? Well, depending on who is responsible for this dream, it's definitely plausible that they are being deceptive. But what purpose would be served by lying about the year the Purge took place? Telling John it's been 12 years has no impact on his actions moving forward whatsoever. If the dream had told him it had been 17 years, or instead simply didn't mention how long it had been, would Locke's course of action have played out any differently? I see no reason to believe it would. So with no discernible motive for intentionally lying to John, I think we can rule that option out too. This next comment comes from Lethologica02, who says, I'm also a 1992 believer, but I do think there's one more, very weak, piece of logic that can be thrown against the idea that Dream Horace was telling the truth. While you are correct that there's no motive for lying, some people are compulsive liars. Ben is shown to compulsively lie throughout the show, claiming to be a Gemini and that his mother taught him to read, when neither are true, and the truth would change nothing. However, as you likely agree, we don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that Jacob, Horace, the island, or the Man in Black are compulsive liars. These, of course, being the four potential examples of who or what could be communicating with John in this dream. All of their lies that we have seen have always seemed to have a particular purpose, unlike Ben's compulsive lies. So the Horace apparition could have lied to Locke simply because the source of the dream comes from a compulsive liar, but because Ben and maybe Widmore are the only compulsive liars definitively identified as such in the show, it's unlikely that Dream Horace was compulsively lying. So there's really not much for me to add to that. They did a great job of summing up what my perspective is on this. The only thing I would maybe add is that from a narrative perspective, the lies that Ben tells that don't serve his agenda in some way do sort of serve a storytelling purpose. When Jack asks how Ben can read and he responds, "My mother taught me," that's a funny joke. But it's even funnier for the people that aren't just casually watching it and remember that Ben's mom died in childbirth. The same thing is true of the scene in which the Man in Black approaches Ben, says, "Can I ask you a question?" And Ben responds, "I'm a Gemini." Again, on the surface, that's a funny joke. But to less casual viewers, it's made even funnier because we know his exact birthday is December 19th, which would make him a Sagittarius, not a Gemini. So in these examples of Ben lying without a manipulative purpose behind the lies, what I feel is important to note is that we, the audience, know that they're lies. And therefore, these false statements by Ben serve the narrative purpose of reminding us that we really can't trust anything this character says. And we should always question what he tells us. In the dream, though, everything we had been told up until this point had indicated the Purge occurred in 1992. So we, the audience, would have no reason to distrust the 12 years comment. And therefore, it would not serve the narrative purpose of warning us not to trust the dream. And even if it had later been clearly established that the 1987 date is actually when the Purge occurred, this wouldn't have retroactively revealed something about the nature of that dream. So taking that and combining it with what Lethologica02 already said, I would say that I do not find the compulsive lying explanation for the 12 years statement to be a satisfying one. And we know Rousseau never ventured into Dharma-occupied areas, apart from the radio tower, probably due to Ben's threat.
If you ever come looking for me, I'll kill you. And if you want your child to live, every time you hear whispers, you run the other way.
This brings me to a comment from John Bruce, who says, Danielle cannot be relied upon for factual information. Saeed asked her in season 1 if she had seen other people on this island, which she replied, "No, I hear them, they whisper." A very dramatic moment on the first viewing, but an absolute lie as we discover her baby was kidnapped on the island. Making matters worse, it was Ben, and she forgot what he looked like when she had him in her net in season 2. So I do agree that Rousseau can't be relied upon for factual information. I think the closest I come in this video to doing that is when I reference what she says about not recognizing the hatch or having never seen anything like the flame station before. I cite those statements of hers as evidence that she probably wasn't around a Dharma facility at the time of the Purge, and therefore was likely safe from the gas. But even if Danielle was flat out lying about never seeing another Dharma station besides the radio tower, I think it's fair to say that statistically speaking, it's not only possible, but probable that Danielle was not near a Dharma Initiative station on December 19th of 1992. As for the idea that what she says to Saeed about never seeing other people on the island being a flat out lie, as well as the idea that she didn't remember Ben, I don't really agree with this assessment. Alex's abduction occurs in the middle of the night, and while we, the audience, are able to see the actors' faces as we see the scene unfold, I do not believe she could see him. And then, 16 years later, when she catches him in her net, I do think on a subconscious level, she recognized his voice. And that is why she is so certain that he is one of them. Anyways, if we can agree that she didn't actually see Ben that night, then what she said to Saeed is actually true. At least until you account for Jin, who is an other person that she did see and interact with, and indeed did refer to as a carrier, something that she later told Saeed these other people were. But even then, you could technically make the case that she's only seen one other person. And so when Saeed asks, "You've seen other people on this island," and she says no, that is still technically true. She hasn't seen other people. She's only seen one person, and then she's heard others whispering. I know that might be stretching the semantics a little bit, especially considering that I do agree with John's main point that Danielle is not a reliable narrator. And the things she says should not be relied on as factual information, at least not by themselves. At which point both groups would then be convinced Ben is secretly feeding the other side useless information while truly working for them. This would ensure Ben is in the inner circle of both groups and would put him in a situation where he spends time in both camps, building relationships in both communities, which will eventually enable him to both execute the Purge and overthrow Widmore, then taking leadership of what remains of both groups. The last comment I wanted to address today is from user JulTom10630, who says, related question to this topic. Do you think someone else other than Ben and Ethan defected from Dharma to the hostiles/others? Maybe Tom is the likeliest candidate because of his comment to Sawyer when he was locked in the cage in the beginning of season 3 about the fish biscuits and it only took the bears 2 hours. So yeah, in this video, and then especially in Getting Lost number 12, Changing Rules, I talk quite a bit about how I think there were several Dharma defectors that Ben sort of recruited from inside of Dharma. And that is how I believe he was able to execute the Purge on the island, which would have required access to the Tempest Station and someone that knew how to operate it, as well as the Purge off-island, which would have occurred at the Ann Arbor headquarters and the lamppost station in LA, and perhaps other off-island locations. But the reason I did want to address this comment is because of their mentioning of Tom. It's not super important, but in my headcanon, I like to imagine that Tom was the head of security for Dharma that was brought in after LaFleur disappeared. Obviously, they would have needed to replace him for the last 10 to 15 years they were around. And because of the nature of the relationship between Sawyer and Tom and how antagonistic it is, I've always liked the idea that they both had that same role. And then, yes, in that scenario, obviously, Tom would have been one of the Dharma members that Ben was able to turn. Like I said, that's not a particularly relevant theory or interpretation, and I don't know that I ever would have shared that if somebody hadn't kind of brought that up. So by no means am I trying to say that anyone should necessarily be on board with that idea. But I like it. But okay, I think that's everything I have for this follow-up. The next video you should see from me will be my next theory and explanation video, which should be up 2 weeks after this one is released. As always, I hope you guys come back for that one.
Oh, you're still here. Hopefully that means you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider sticking around and being a constant for this channel by clicking right up here to subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell icon if you would like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive. In the meantime, feel free to check out previous content from this channel by clicking here or here. Oh no. Please subscribe.